The ocean gave Port Providence its moods, silver in the mornings, blue as enamel by noon, and slate when storms rolled in from the shoals. Isabella Carter measured her days against that palette. She worked the midshift at Harbor and Hugh, a cramped art supply shop that smelled of linseed oil and graphite, where brushes hung in neat rows like small flags of possibility. After closing, she hurried home to the mint green house on Laurel Street, where her mother, Marina, kept the porch light glowing and a kettle simmering. Marina had been widowed since Isabella was 15. She filled quiet with music, old jazz standards on a battered radio, and mischief, clipping recipes she swore she'd try, pinning watercolor postcards to the fridge. Isabella's room was a blur of canvases leaning like conversations against the walls, a splatter-crusted easel by the window, and a shoebox of secret sketches, her mother dozing with a book half open, gulls wheeling over the lighthouse, the hands of strangers on a ferry deck. Money was thin, but attention was abundant. On Sundays, Isabella sketched in the park while Marina bartered cuttings with gardeners who promised her peonies as big as wedding cakes. It was a small life, maybe, but it fit like a soft sweater, warm, a little worn, honest in its stitches. If there was an ache in Isabella, it was the ache of almost a gallery showing, almost the nerve to send a portfolio to a Boston curator, almost believing her quiet could matter. She kept lists, pigments to buy when she had an extra 20, part-time classes she'd take if Harbor and Hugh ever gave her a raise, frames she'd build when she had more time. Time, like paint, was always in shorter supply than she hoped. The invitation came on heavy cream paper that glimmered under the kitchen lamp. Coastal Voices, New Artists of New England, the heading declared, with her name, inked beneath it as if the letters had finally learned how to stand tall. Marina pressed the card to her chest and danced a small, triumphant figure 8 in wool socks. "You'll need a dress," she said, already plotting which of her vintage scarves might be convinced into elegance. The gallery was a renovated boathouse at the edge of the marina, all white rafters and glass, and the evening smelled faintly of salt and champagne. Margaret Hayes, Isabella's college roommate turned fearless chef, arrived with a bakery box that made the curator tear up. She had always been that way, generosity disguised as pastry. 3 of Isabella's pieces hung along the western wall, a storm blown into water and fire, a child's hand catching sun through sea glass, and a self-portrait she had nearly hidden, a face half in shadow, jaw set with a tenderness that could be mistaken for defiance. People drifted, murmuring, glasses chiming like soft bells. Isabella tried to memorize the ordinary miracles, a stranger tilting his head at a brushstroke as if it were a question only he could answer, Marina wiping her eyes through a laugh, Margaret glaring at anyone who came too close with a canopy and careless fingers. The night hummed with possibility, but under it pulsed a thread of nerves, taut and bright, as though the tide itself were holding its breath. He arrived as the gulls began to fold themselves into the dusk. Nathan Carter's suit was the color of rain on metal, his tie, a precise blue that did not occur by accident. He spoke in a voice that made space for itself, low, confident, practiced in the art of the unhurried question. "Are you the artist?" he asked, stopping at the self-portrait. Isabella nodded, suddenly aware of the paint under her nails as if it were a secret she'd brought to the party by mistake. He smiled, handsome, yes, but with a glimmer like a knife-catching light. He named the painter of her frame's bevels, noted the cool bias of her palette, and asked who had taught her to anchor a composition with shadow rather than line. Compliments, but curated, curiosity, but steered. He bought the storm painting at asking price, then the sea glass child at 10% above, as if spending were simply confirming his preferences. Margaret, arriving with a plate, watched the exchange with the same expression she wore when taste-testing a sauce that needed one more truth. "Banker," she mouthed later, in the corner by the coat rack, as if the word explained everything, the impeccable watch, the calm predation of someone who found weakness in spreadsheets and tides alike. Marina, charmed, told Isabella he had kind eyes. Nathan asked to walk Isabella along the pier after the gallery closed, and the night obliged, the water slick black, the lighthouse blinking its measured benediction, the wind smelling of oranges from a caterer's peels tossed into the bin. Nathan talked about art markets as though they were weather systems, inevitable, navigable, profitable. Isabella talked about light. Somewhere between his story of a client dinner on Beacon Hill and her confession that she was afraid of failing where no one could see, the first hinge clicked softly into place. She would later learn to hear it, the sound of a door beginning to close as another opened, but in that moment it was only a pleasant click in the heart, an almost yes that felt like hope. Nathan Carter's childhood had been a careful choreography of privilege and pressure. Born to Leonard and Celeste Carter, names that carried weight in the Boston finance world, Nathan grew up in a brownstone where conversations at the dinner table sounded like boardroom briefings. His father, a senior partner at a private investment firm, spoke in numbers and forecasts, rarely in feelings. His mother hosted charity luncheons for causes she scarcely understood, her philanthropy as polished as her pearl necklaces. Nathan's education was a straight line drawn by expectation: preparatory school at St. Augustine's, a double major in economics and political science at Columbia, and an MBA at Wharton. Summers were spent interning at firms where the interns already had trust funds, and vacations were in places where the sand was imported and the sea was for show. For Nathan, wealth was not merely a comfort, it was the oxygen of his identity. He measured people the way his father measured stocks, by their yield potential. Friends were useful if they could open doors, partners valuable if they could elevate his image, and hobbies worthwhile only if they impressed. Music lessons, fencing, even a short-lived interest in sailing, all were curated to produce a man whose handshake meant opportunity. But beneath the gloss, there was a restlessness, a hunger that no acquisition could satisfy. Nathan didn't just want to live well, he wanted to be seen as someone who belonged in rooms where the air itself seemed rarefied. When Nathan first saw Isabella at the gallery, she was unlike the women he usually dated: no designer dress, no rehearsed laugh, no practiced tilt of the chin to catch the light. She wasn't trying to network, she was simply existing in the space, absorbed in conversations about color theory and brushwork. He found it novel, even refreshing, in the way a minimalist painting might surprise you in a room full of ornate frames. But beyond novelty, there was calculation. Nathan knew art was currency in certain circles, not the paint-and-canvas kind, but the cultural fluency it signified. An artist on his arm could soften his sharper edges, make him seem more approachable at fundraisers, more layered in interviews. He had dated models, attorneys, consultants, people whose ambitions aligned with his own in clean, upward lines. Isabella's ambition was different. It was quieter, inward, something that looked like humility but could be presented as depth. In Nathan's mind, she was a kind of asset, unpolished enough to appear authentic, talented enough to impress, and unentangled enough to be shaped. He wondered, even that first night, how her life might fit into his like a final piece in a puzzle whose picture was always his to arrange. Behind Nathan's confident exterior was a man who viewed relationships as transactions, though he would never admit it aloud. He knew how to charm, how to lean in just enough, how to hold eye contact a beat longer than necessary, how to sprinkle in personal anecdotes that felt intimate but revealed nothing truly vulnerable. Women often mistook his attentiveness for depth, not realizing it was part of a larger strategy. In truth, Nathan feared intimacy the way some fear deep water, not because he couldn't swim, but because he couldn't control the currents. His parents' marriage had been a cold arrangement, both too proud to divorce and too indifferent to love. From them, he learned that appearances were worth protecting at all costs, even if the inside was hollow. He carried that lesson into adulthood, curating a life that looked enviable from the outside: the right address, the right car, the right company. Meeting Isabella didn't disrupt that philosophy, it simply added a new element to it. She could be the unexpected detail that made the whole picture more compelling. He told himself it was fate that brought him to the gallery that night, but in truth, Nathan didn't believe in fate. He believed in opportunity, and Isabella Carter, though she didn't know it yet, was about to become one. The days following the gallery opening unfolded like a meticulously written script, with Nathan directing each scene. He called Isabella 2 days after their meeting, not the next day, which might seem overeager, but soon enough to suggest genuine interest. His voice was smooth over the phone, almost warm, and he invited her to lunch at a harborside bistro she'd only ever admired from the street. Isabella hesitated, and used to the attention, but agreed after Marina teased her for acting like a shy schoolgirl. At the bistro, Nathan was attentive, asking about her paintings, her process, even the small art shop where she worked. He listened in a way that made her feel seen, nodding thoughtfully at her answers, his gaze steady and unbroken. He spoke of the beauty of investing in creativity, of how art was a language beyond currency, though Isabella noticed he never missed a chance to slip in a detail about his business trips or the circles he moved in. She told herself it wasn't arrogance, just a different world he inhabited. Over time, lunches turned into dinners, dinners into weekend drives up the coast, where Nathan would surprise her with stays at charming inns or tickets to exhibits in Boston. There was a sense of being swept along in something grand, and though part of her felt breathless, another part was quietly afraid to lose her footing. Margaret noticed the changes first. She and Isabella met for coffee at their usual spot, a modest cafe with chipped mugs and mismatched chairs. As Isabella recounted Nathan's latest gesture, a weekend in Cape Cod complete with a private tour of a lighthouse, Margaret stirred her coffee slowly, her expression neutral. "He's generous," she said finally, but there was a weight behind the words. Isabella laughed off the concern, insisting Nathan was simply different from the men they'd known in college. Margaret didn't argue, but she asked more questions. Did Nathan ever ask about her family beyond polite curiosity? Did he know her dreams beyond the surface of her art? Isabella brushed them aside, unwilling to invite doubt into something that, for the first time in years, felt like it might grow into permanence. Nathan's charm was undeniable. He remembered her favorite flowers, sent her small but thoughtful gifts, and never arrived without an air of deliberate effort, as though every moment with her was an event to be curated. He seemed to value her opinion, inviting her to art events and encouraging her to mingle with his acquaintances. In those spaces, Isabella felt both flattered and out of place, aware of the way some women looked her over with polite appraisal, as if calculating her worth. Nathan would take her hand in those moments, a subtle reassurance that she belonged, and she clung to that feeling. But beneath the glow of new love, subtle fractures were already forming. Nathan's attentiveness sometimes felt rehearsed, his compliments too precise, as though they were lifted from a manual on courtship. He seldom shared anything truly personal. His stories were polished anecdotes meant for cocktail parties, not the unguarded confessions that build intimacy. Isabella noticed, too, that their outings always seemed to fit neatly into his schedule, his convenience. If she suggested something spontaneous, Nathan would smile indulgently but rarely agree. Still, these observations floated in the back of her mind, overshadowed by the thrill of his presence and the way he seemed to open doors she hadn't dared to knock on before. In quieter moments, alone in her bedroom after a date, or when Marina asked if she was truly happy, Isabella would recall the night at the pier, the scent of salt and oranges, the way Nathan's voice softened when he asked her about light, and she would convince herself that this was different, that the story unfolding between them was one she had waited her whole life to read. What she didn't realize was that Nathan was reading from a script he'd used before, one that began with flowers and laughter but always, inevitably, ended on his terms. The wedding was a spectacle that seemed ripped from the glossy pages of a luxury bridal magazine. Nathan's parents insisted on hosting it at the Rosewood Manor, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Boston, its gardens manicured to perfection and its ballroom boasting gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers that caught every flicker of candlelight. Isabella, who had once imagined a small seaside ceremony with the scent of salt in the air, found herself swept into fittings for designer gowns, elaborate menu tastings, and rehearsals overseen by a wedding planner whose clipboard seemed to carry the weight of law. The guest list ballooned into the hundreds: Nathan's business associates, his parents' influential friends, distant relatives she had never met and would likely never see again. Marina sat quietly during the planning meetings, watching her daughter try to reconcile the grandeur with the intimacy she'd once dreamed of. "It's your day," Marina would whisper, a gentle reminder that seemed to grow fainter with every decision deferred to Nathan's side of the family. Still, Isabella told herself that the size, the glitter, the formality, it was all a reflection of how much Nathan wanted to celebrate her, to claim her in front of the world. That thought carried her through the mounting pressure, the endless fittings, and the subtle but unmistakable feeling that she was being styled into someone else's idea of a bride. On the day itself, the air was heavy with the scent of roses and anticipation. Isabella stepped into the ballroom to the soft swell of a string quartet, her gown a cascade of silk and lace that trailed behind her like a whisper. Guests turned, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, admiration, and polite appraisal. Nathan stood at the altar, impeccably dressed, his smile confident and perfectly timed as their eyes met. Beside him, his sister Clara watched quietly, her gaze unreadable. The vows were traditional, the exchange of rings seamless, and yet there was a moment, fleeting but sharp, when Isabella felt the weight of every eye on her and wondered if they were witnessing love or performance. Marina's tears were genuine, and Margaret's enthusiastic wave from the second row brought a rush of warmth that anchored Isabella in the moment. The reception unfolded in waves of toasts, dancing, and laughter. Nathan's father delivered a speech about legacy, his words polished but impersonal, while Celeste spoke of welcoming Isabella into the Carter family as though reciting a carefully rehearsed script. Isabella danced with Nathan under the glittering light, her smile steady, her mind lingering on the faint dissonance between the intimacy she craved and the spectacle she inhabited. Later in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the music softened, Isabella stepped out onto the terrace for air. The gardens glowed under strings of fairy lights, and the scent of lavender drifted on the breeze. Clara found her there, holding 2 glasses of champagne. She offered one to Isabella and said quietly, "You look beautiful tonight. But I hope he lets you keep that." At Isabella's puzzled glance, Clara added, "You're light. The way you look like yourself, even here." Before Isabella could respond, Nathan appeared, slipping an arm around her waist and steering her back inside, where the photographer was ready for another round of posed perfection. The moment was gone, but Clara's words lingered, settling somewhere deep and unspoken. Isabella didn't know it yet, but that quiet warning would resurface years later, in a far different context, when the glitter had long faded, and the promises spoken under chandeliers had dissolved into shadows. For now, she was a newlywed in a story that still felt like a dream, unaware that the script had already been written. Married life in Nathan's upscale Beacon Hill condo was a far cry from the mint green house on Laurel Street. The space was sleek and minimalist, with clean lines, high ceilings, and art chosen for its price tag rather than its meaning. The walls were painted in cool, neutral tones that seemed to absorb sound, and Isabella often found herself speaking more softly, as though afraid to disturb the curated calm. At first, she tried to make the place her own, placing a jar of wildflowers on the marble kitchen island, hanging a watercolor of the marina above the dining table, but Nathan would casually move or replace them, explaining that they didn't fit the aesthetic. He wasn't unkind about it, just matter of fact, as though home decor were a science she simply didn't understand. Her easel, once the centerpiece of her bedroom, was relegated to a narrow corner of the guest room, until we figure out a better space for it, Nathan had said, a promise that was never revisited. Days took on a new rhythm, Nathan rising early to read financial reports over espresso, Isabella tidying the silent apartment, preparing meals, and waiting for him to return from the office or another networking event. She told herself this was just the adjustment period, that all marriages required compromise, but in the quiet of the afternoons, she sometimes missed the warmth and chaos of her old life. Nathan's schedule grew busier, his absences longer. At first, he encouraged Isabella to keep painting, but it soon became clear that he valued her art more as a charming hobby than as a serious pursuit. When she mentioned applying to a local gallery's open call, Nathan smiled and said, "Why stress yourself? You have the luxury not to work. Enjoy it." The words were framed as generosity, but they landed like a soft cage, gilded and inescapable. Social obligations filled the calendar, corporate dinners, charity galas, weekends at country clubs. Nathan was always impeccable in these settings, his hand at the small of her back, his introduction smooth, "My wife, the artist." It was flattering, but Isabella noticed that he never encouraged her to discuss her work in depth, steering conversations back to safer, more superficial topics. In private, their interactions grew more transactional. If she brought up missing her mother or wanting to visit her old neighborhood, Nathan would nod distractedly, promising sometime soon without committing to a date. Marina visited occasionally, but the condo made her visibly uncomfortable, and Isabella found herself adjusting her mother's speech or dress to avoid Nathan's subtle, disapproving glances. Margaret remained her lifeline, inviting her to the bustling warmth of her restaurant kitchen whenever Nathan was away. There, Isabella could laugh freely, flour on her hands, music blaring, the air fragrant with roasted garlic and fresh herbs. Margaret noticed the changes, how Isabella seemed quieter, more careful with her words, and gently probed, but Isabella brushed it off, insisting she was just settling into married life. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, she would lie awake, listening to Nathan's steady breathing beside her, and feel a strange emptiness settle in her chest. It wasn't unhappiness exactly, more like standing in a beautiful room and realizing you didn't have the key to leave. She reminded herself of their wedding vows, of the pier and the oranges, of the way Nathan's gaze had once seemed to see her. The memory was comforting, but also faint, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. What she couldn't see yet was that the walls around her were not just the sleek, minimalist ones of the condo, they were the beginnings of a life that Nathan had designed to fit his vision, a vision in which her own colors were slowly, almost imperceptibly, being painted over. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind where the city streets shimmered under a veil of drizzle and the air felt heavy with possibility. Isabella had been feeling unusually tired for weeks, her appetite swinging between ravenous and non-existent, her mood shifting like the tide. She attributed it to the gray weather and the restless nights spent waiting for Nathan to return from late meetings. But when a queasy wave hit her in the middle of folding laundry, she sat down hard on the edge of the bed, heart thudding. 2 hours later, she stood in the bathroom staring at a positive pregnancy test, her hands trembling around the small plastic stick. 1,000 thoughts collided: joy, fear, disbelief. She imagined telling Nathan, his arms around her, their laughter mingling with the rain outside. She imagined Marina's tearful joy, Margaret's squeals, a nursery painted in soft pastels. That evening, when Nathan walked in, shaking off his umbrella, she blurted the news before he could even take off his coat. He blinked, processing, then smiled, polished, controlled, but genuine enough to make her believe he was pleased. "We'll need to make adjustments," he said, his mind already moving to logistics, finances, timelines. Isabella clung to the moment, even if his embrace felt more like a congratulatory pat than an outpouring of shared excitement. Pregnancy brought both beauty and vulnerability. Isabella's body changed in ways she hadn't expected, the swell of her belly, the ache in her back, the strange fluttering beneath her ribs that grew stronger each day. She found herself slowing down, savoring quiet mornings with tea, sketching the curve of her own silhouette in the mirror, as though recording the transformation for herself. Nathan, meanwhile, became even more consumed with work. He accompanied her to the first ultrasound, smiling for the sonographer's benefit, but afterward treated the appointment as just another box ticked. When Isabella suggested attending birthing classes together, Nathan demurred, citing a conference in Chicago. Marina stepped in without hesitation, attending every appointment she could, massaging Isabella's swollen feet, cooking her soups rich with vegetables and herbs. Margaret was a constant source of levity, sneaking her forbidden pastries and painting a tiny mural of woodland animals on a spare canvas for the baby's future room. In those moments, Isabella felt surrounded by love, even if it wasn't always from the person she most hoped would give it. She kept telling herself Nathan was just under pressure, that once the baby arrived, he would be more present. Ethan Carter came into the world on a snowy December night, as if winter itself had paused to witness his arrival. Labor was long and grueling, the sterile hospital room softened only by Marina's firm grip on her hand and Margaret's quiet reassurances between contractions. Nathan arrived midway through, his tie askew, muttering about traffic delays. He stayed at her side for the final push, and when Ethan's thin, startled cry filled the room, Nathan's eyes flickered with something, pride, perhaps, or simply the realization that fatherhood was no longer abstract. Isabella held her son against her chest, marveling at his tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers, his dark lashes resting against skin still flushed from birth. Nathan kissed her forehead, murmuring, "You did well," before stepping aside to take a phone call in the hallway. The hospital stay was a blur of nurses, paperwork, and visitors. Clara came, bringing a knitted blanket and a rare softness in her smile. Marina wept openly, cradling her grandson, while Margaret took 100 pictures and declared herself the fun aunt on the spot. Isabella's heart swelled in those moments, her exhaustion softened by the love around her. But as the snow fell outside and Nathan excused himself yet again for urgent work matters, a quiet truth began to take root: the life she envisioned, with Nathan as an equal partner in their new chapter, might already be slipping out of reach. The first year of Ethan's life was a blur of midnight feedings, soft lullabies, and the endless cycle of diapers, bottles, and naps. Isabella found herself anchored in a world both exhausting and beautiful, her days revolving around the tiny human who had stolen her heart. She loved the quiet hours when Ethan would sleep against her chest, his breathing warm and steady, the weight of him a reassurance that she was doing something right. Yet those moments often occurred without Nathan. His work trips grew longer, his evenings later, and when he was home, his attention was fragmented, eyes glued to his phone, mind tethered to emails. At first, Isabella excused it, telling herself he was providing for their family, but the silences between them began to stretch like cracks in plaster. He would ask perfunctory questions about Ethan's milestones, "He's sitting up now," and offer brief smiles before shifting the conversation back to a business deal or an upcoming corporate gala. The warmth she had once felt in his presence was cooling into something more distant, and though she tried to ignore it, the distance was becoming a constant companion in their home. By the time Ethan turned 2, the cracks had widened. Isabella began to suggest returning to painting, not just for income but for her own sanity. She missed the colors, the tactile joy of blending pigments, the meditative focus of creation. Nathan listened one evening over dinner but set down his fork with a faintly patronizing smile. "There's no rush," he said, his tone dismissive. "We're comfortable. You don't need to work." The implication was clear. Her role was to maintain the home and care for Ethan, not to pursue her own ambitions. It wasn't an outright prohibition, but it stung. That night, after Ethan was asleep, she stood in the unused guest room where her easel gathered dust and thought about the version of herself who had once dreamed of gallery openings. Marina noticed her daughter's growing melancholy and suggested bringing Ethan to visit the coast more often, a reminder of the life she once had. Nathan, however, called it unnecessary travel and argued it would disrupt Ethan's routine. Conversations about family visits, her friends, or any plans outside his schedule became negotiations, with Isabella quietly conceding more often than she fought. Margaret became her outlet, inviting her to lunch or stopping by unannounced with pastries and sharp humor. One afternoon, while Isabella was recounting Nathan's reluctance to let her attend a weekend art workshop, Margaret set down her coffee with a thud. "You're shrinking," she said bluntly. "And he doesn't even see it." Isabella wanted to argue, but the truth of it lodged in her throat. She loved Nathan, or perhaps she loved the memory of who she thought he was, but she could not deny that the man she'd married was no longer reaching for her in the way he once had. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed and kissed his forehead, she made a silent promise. She would find a way to hold on to herself for his sake, even if Nathan's approval never came. She didn't know then how much that promise would matter, or how soon she would need to choose between the life Nathan offered and the one she would have to rebuild with her own two hands. The cracks were widening, and she could already hear the faint sound of something, perhaps everything, beginning to fracture. By the time Ethan turned 5, his curiosity for the world had taken on a rhythm all its own. He had always been an observant child, but now there was a focus in his gaze, a quiet fascination with sounds and patterns that Isabella began to notice during their daily routines. On rainy afternoons, when other children in the neighborhood sprawled on floors with toy cars or cartoons, Ethan would sit cross-legged by the window, tapping spoons, pencils, or anything he could find against various surfaces to create different tones. One afternoon, while tidying the living room, Isabella found him seated at Marina's old upright piano, which had been moved to their home after her passing. His small fingers were pressing the keys in slow succession, his head tilted as though he were listening for something only he could hear. She assumed it was a child's idle play, until he began stringing the notes into patterns that, while unrefined, carried an instinctive harmony. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, genuinely startled. Ethan shrugged with the easy honesty of a child. "It just sounds nice this way, Mommy." From that moment, Isabella paid closer attention, noting how quickly he could repeat melodies from memory, how he hummed with uncanny pitch while helping her bake cookies, and how music seemed to pull him into a world where he was entirely at ease. Nathan, however, dismissed it as a passing phase. When Isabella mentioned enrolling Ethan in beginner music lessons, Nathan chuckled and said, "He's 5, Bella. Kids bang on things. That doesn't mean he's the next Mozart." He suggested sports instead, insisting it would toughen him up and help him fit in. But Isabella, recalling the way Ethan's face lit up at the sound of a particular chord, was unwilling to let the spark fade. She signed him up for an affordable after-school music program at the community center, using her own savings from selling a few small commissioned paintings. The first day, she watched from the hallway as Ethan, barely tall enough to see over the piano keys, followed the teacher's instructions with rapt attention, his little hands moving as though they had been waiting for this all along. Within weeks, his instructor pulled Isabella aside to express genuine amazement at Ethan's ear for music and his natural ability to adapt to different instruments. "He's gifted," the teacher said, not as flattery but as a professional observation. Those words nestled in Isabella's heart, a bright counterpoint to the growing shadows in her marriage. As Ethan's abilities blossomed, so did his joy. He would come home from the community center eager to show Isabella the pieces he had learned, sometimes improvising entirely new ones with a confidence that surprised even her. His music became the background to their evenings, soft piano notes drifting from the living room while Isabella prepared dinner, his humming mingling with the scent of garlic and rosemary. Margaret became one of his biggest fans, often requesting Ethan concerts whenever she visited, clapping as though she were in a grand hall. Even Clara, who stopped by occasionally despite her strained relationship with Nathan, would sit quietly and listen, her eyes warm in a way that made Isabella suspect she understood more than she said. Yet the joy of Ethan's gift was often tempered by Nathan's indifference. He rarely attended recitals, always citing work or prior commitments, and when he did, his praise was lukewarm, his attention divided between his phone and the stage. Isabella began to realize that Nathan's inability to value Ethan's talent mirrored the way he undervalued her own art. Still, she held on to the certainty that nurturing her son's gift was non-negotiable, even if it meant quietly going against Nathan's wishes. What she didn't know was that the music Ethan played so effortlessly would one day become both their salvation and the very thing Nathan would try to claim as his own. It began with a cough, light at first, the kind Isabella thought would vanish with honey tea and a warm blanket. But within weeks, Ethan's bright energy dimmed, his once boundless curiosity slowed by fatigue. The music that used to pour from the living room like sunlight was replaced by silence, broken only by the sound of his uneven breathing. Isabella's worry grew with every pale morning, every meal he barely touched, every day he asked to stay in bed instead of going to school. Multiple visits to the pediatrician brought vague reassurances, seasonal allergies, perhaps a lingering cold, but when his condition worsened, Isabella pushed for more tests. Nathan, when she called to update him during one of his business trips, sounded distracted, his responses clipped. "Kids get sick," he said, as though she were overreacting. But Isabella knew her son, something was wrong. The night he fainted on the way to the bathroom, she scooped him up in trembling arms and drove straight to the hospital, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Ethan was admitted for observation, and the sterile white walls of the pediatric ward became an unwelcome backdrop to the most terrifying days of her life. The diagnosis, a rare autoimmune condition, hit like a hammer. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, explaining that with proper treatment, Ethan could recover, but the process would be long and expensive. Isabella sat in the hospital corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, trying to process the flood of information while Ethan slept in his room. When she relayed the news to Nathan that evening, she expected concern, even urgency. Instead, his voice on the other end of the line was cold, almost irritated. "Do you have any idea how much this will cost?" he asked. Isabella, stunned, tried to steer the conversation back to Ethan's needs, but Nathan cut her off. "I'm already stretched thin with work. We can't let this turn into a drain on everything I've built." His choice of words, "everything I've built," was a knife twist. She reminded him that Ethan was his son, that this was about saving a child's life, but Nathan's tone only hardened. "I can't carry both of you as a financial burden," he said flatly. "You'll have to figure some of this out yourself." When she ended the call, her hands were shaking, but the tremor wasn't from fear anymore, it was from a dawning realization that she was, in many ways, already alone. The final break came 2 days later. Nathan arrived at the hospital, not with flowers or comfort, but with a legal folder. He told her he had been thinking about their situation and decided it would be best for everyone if they separated. His words were rehearsed, almost businesslike, as if he were dissolving a partnership instead of abandoning his family. Isabella sat there, numb, listening as he talked about financial stability, emotional strain, and personal boundaries, phrases that sounded professional and sterile but translated to one thing: he didn't want the responsibility. Ethan, too weak to understand, asked why Daddy wasn't staying, and Nathan, without looking at her, told their son he had to work more so Mommy could focus on him. Isabella clenched her jaw, holding her tears until Nathan walked away. That night, she sat beside Ethan's bed, stroking his hair, and silently vowed that no matter what it took, she would fight for him. The man she had once trusted had made his choice, and in doing so, had revealed the truth she could no longer deny. Nathan saw love as conditional, valuable only when it was convenient. But for her, motherhood was not conditional, it was an unshakable promise. And in that sterile hospital room, with the machines quietly beeping and her son's small hand curled around her fingers, Isabella decided she would keep that promise even if it meant losing everything else. The divorce papers came in a plain manila envelope, delivered to the hospital front desk by a courier who barely met Isabella's eyes. She had known it was coming. Nathan's last visit had been nothing more than a performance of detachment, but the sight of her name printed alongside his in cold legal font still left her breathless. Sitting in the sterile hospital waiting area, she stared at the pages, the ink blurring as tears threatened to spill. There were no handwritten notes, no apology, not even a promise to check in on Ethan. It was simply a transaction, finalized with his signature, severing the life they had built. The agreement was straightforward: no alimony, no shared custody, no financial support beyond what was legally unavoidable, and Nathan had already arranged to minimize even that. His lawyer had worded everything in a way that left her responsible for the majority of Ethan's medical expenses, citing Nathan's limited availability and heavy work commitments as justification. It was abandonment dressed in the language of efficiency. Marina came to the hospital that evening, her face tight with barely contained anger, and took the envelope from Isabella's hands. "He's already lost, Bella," she said softly. "He just doesn't know it yet." But Isabella knew that in practical terms, the loss was hers to bear, hers and Ethan's. The following weeks blurred into a relentless routine of care. Isabella stayed by Ethan's side through every treatment, every lab test, every sleepless night when he whimpered in discomfort. She barely ate, living on cafeteria coffee and the occasional sandwich brought by Margaret, who visited whenever her restaurant schedule allowed. Margaret's fierce loyalty was a lifeline. She'd sit beside Isabella, listening without judgment, offering advice only when asked. "He left because he's weak," she would say about Nathan, her voice tinged with contempt. "You're still here because you're strong." Clara's visits were quieter, less frequent, but no less meaningful. Nathan's sister seemed weighed down by guilt, though she never spoke Nathan's name. Instead, she brought small comforts for Ethan, a puzzle, a book of music for beginners, and sat by his bed reading aloud. Each gesture reminded Isabella that while Nathan had turned his back, not everyone connected to him had done the same. Still, the reality of single parenthood, combined with mounting medical bills, loomed over her like a storm cloud. Her savings, modest to begin with, were dwindling faster than she could replenish them. One evening, after Ethan had finally fallen into a deep sleep, Isabella slipped into the dimly lit hospital courtyard for air. The winter wind bit at her cheeks, carrying the faint scent of salt from the distant harbor. She thought about the woman she had been before Nathan, hopeful, full of dreams, unafraid to imagine a future painted in her own colors. That woman felt far away now, buried under months of exhaustion and grief. Yet as she stood there, staring up at the unfeeling stars, a strange calm settled over her. Nathan had made his choice, and while the betrayal cut deep, it also clarified something. There was no one left to wait for, no one to hope might change. The responsibility, the struggle, the fight, it was hers alone now. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she realized she would rather face it with nothing but her own resolve than continue living in the shadow of someone who measured love in terms of convenience. With a final deep breath, she returned to Ethan's room, brushed a hand through his hair, and whispered a promise into the quiet: "We're going to make it, baby. No matter what." The discharge from the hospital should have been a relief, but for Isabella, it marked the beginning of a harsher chapter. Without Nathan's financial support, she had to piece together a life for herself and Ethan with whatever she could manage. They moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment above a florist shop on the quieter side of town. The place smelled faintly of roses and eucalyptus from the shop below, a scent that clung to their clothes and drifted into their dreams. The walls were thin, the kitchen small, and the furniture a patchwork of hand-me-downs from Marina, Margaret, and even Clara, who discreetly sent over a sturdy bed frame for Ethan. The space was humble, but it was theirs, a place where Nathan's shadow did not stretch into every corner. Still, Isabella knew sentiment alone wouldn't pay rent or medical bills. She juggled part-time shifts at a neighborhood bakery in the mornings, cashier work at a hardware store in the afternoons, and freelance commissions for watercolor portraits at night. Sleep became a luxury, replaced by the constant rhythm of work, care, and worry. Her body ached, her hands grew calloused, but she told herself that every tired breath was proof she was still fighting. Ethan's recovery was fragile, and his condition demanded consistent medical checkups, specialized medications, and a careful diet. The schedule was relentless: early morning walks to the clinic, afternoons at the community center when he felt strong enough, evenings filled with quiet activities to conserve his energy. Isabella learned to read the subtle signs of his fatigue, the way his shoulders slumped when the day had been too long, the way his music grew softer when his strength waned. The piano in their living room, a second-hand gift from Margaret's restaurant's former lounge, became both a source of joy and a barometer of his health. Some days, the notes he played were bright and lively, spilling through the thin apartment walls into the florist shop below. Other days, the keys remained untouched, their silence as heavy as the air before a storm. Through it all, Isabella stayed vigilant, carrying a notebook where she tracked his symptoms, medications, and expenses down to the last penny. The numbers rarely balanced, but she learned to stretch every dollar, selling her paintings at weekend markets, even if it meant parting with pieces she had intended to keep. In those early months, the people around her became a lifeline. Margaret often arrived with bags of groceries, claiming they were extras from the restaurant, though Isabella knew better. Marina took the bus into town every other week to cook meals in bulk, freezing them so Isabella wouldn't have to worry about dinner on her busiest days. Daniel Miller, Ethan's pediatric specialist, became more than just a doctor, he became a steady presence in their lives. He took time to explain every step of Ethan's treatment, answering Isabella's questions with patience and respect. Sometimes, after particularly long appointments, he would walk them to the bus stop, making sure Ethan's scarf was snug around his neck. Clara called occasionally, her voice quiet but warm, offering small updates about her own life before asking, "Do you need anything?" Isabella always said no, but she suspected Clara knew the truth. It wasn't the life Isabella had imagined when she married Nathan, it was smaller, harder, and lonelier, but within it, there was a stubborn resilience that she had never truly recognized in herself. She was no longer waiting for someone else to save her. Every day, she was saving herself and her son, piece by piece. Winter arrived early that year, the kind that crept in with sharp winds and gray skies that seemed to press down on the city. For Isabella, the season carried more than just cold, it brought the crushing weight of bills she could no longer keep at bay. Ethan's latest round of treatments had been effective but costly, leaving her with barely enough to cover rent, let alone the heating bill or groceries. She had already trimmed every expense to the bone, no new clothes, no indulgences, no outings beyond necessary errands. Still, the numbers in her worn notebook told the same unforgiving story, she was out of options. One night, after putting Ethan to bed, she stood in the living room surrounded by the remnants of her old life, paintings stacked against the wall, a vintage armchair she'd inherited from Marina, a delicate porcelain lamp that had once belonged to her grandmother. Each item carried a memory, a piece of herself, but she began to see them not as keepsakes but as currency. The next morning, she wrapped them in blankets, loaded them into borrowed crates, and took them to a second-hand store downtown. The shop owner, a man with kind eyes and a sharp instinct for desperation, examined each piece before offering far less than they were worth. Isabella accepted without bargaining, she didn't have the luxury of pride anymore. The hardest decision came when she opened the small wooden jewelry box at the back of her dresser. Inside lay her late mother's ring, a simple gold band with a tiny emerald, worn smooth by years of love and wear. It wasn't flashy, but it had been a constant comfort, a connection to the woman who had taught her to see beauty in the ordinary. Selling it felt like severing that connection, but Ethan's next hospital appointment was in 2 days, and she needed the money for his medication. She took the ring to a pawn shop on the edge of town, the kind of place where the air smelled faintly of metal and regret. The pawnbroker turned it over in his hand, squinting through a jeweler's loupe before naming a figure. Isabella nodded, her throat tight, and slid the ring across the counter. Walking out with the folded bills felt like carrying both salvation and loss in equal measure. She didn't cry until she reached the apartment, where she stood in the kitchen clutching the money, the absence of the ring pressing against her finger like a phantom. That night, she cooked Ethan's favorite dinner, homemade macaroni and cheese, trying to keep her voice light as they ate. He was pale but smiling, chatting about the melody he had been working on at the piano, his small hands tracing invisible keys on the table. Listening to him, Isabella felt a surge of resolve wash over her. She might have sold almost everything she owned, but she still had the one thing Nathan had failed to understand, the determination to fight for her son's life with every breath in her body. Later, after tucking him into bed, she sat alone in the quiet apartment, the space emptier than it had ever been, yet somehow filled with a fierce kind of hope. She didn't know how much further she could stretch herself, but she knew she would find a way. She had to. Because in the end, the paintings, the furniture, even her mother's ring, they were only things. But Ethan was her heart, her future, her reason. And as long as she had him, she would keep going, no matter the cost. Margaret arrived on a Saturday morning, unannounced as always, her arms loaded with grocery bags and her eyes scanning the apartment with quiet calculation. She noticed the bare walls, the missing furniture, the absence of the lamp she had always admired. Isabella tried to pass it off as a little decluttering, but Margaret knew better. She had been Isabella's friend long enough to read the truth in the pauses between her words. Without pressing, she unpacked the groceries, fresh vegetables, chicken, bread still warm from her restaurant's oven, and placed them in the fridge. Then, over coffee, she leaned forward and said, "I've been thinking. You can't keep doing this alone. Not like this." Isabella opened her mouth to protest, but Margaret held up a hand. "I'm not talking about handouts. I have an idea, one that could actually help, and it involves Ethan." That caught Isabella's attention. Margaret explained that her restaurant had been planning a charity event for the local children's hospital, complete with live entertainment. "What if Ethan plays?" she asked, her voice both gentle and firm. "People need to see what he can do, Bella. And if we frame it right, it could raise enough to cover at least a few months of his treatment." Isabella hesitated. Ethan had been recovering, but he was still frail. The thought of putting him on a stage felt risky. Yet Margaret's eyes were steady, and Isabella realized this wasn't just about money. It was about showing Ethan that his music mattered, that he wasn't defined solely by his illness. They began to plan quietly, careful not to overwhelm Ethan. Over the next week, Margaret would stop by after her shifts to listen to him play, offering encouragement and helping him choose pieces that were both manageable and impressive. Clara heard about the plan through Margaret and offered to cover the cost of a proper tuning for the old piano, insisting it was the least she could do. Even Daniel became involved, scheduling Ethan's treatments in a way that allowed him to build up enough energy for the performance. The preparations brought a new kind of life into the apartment, a sense of purpose that wasn't solely about survival. Isabella watched Ethan's confidence grow as he practiced, his fingers gliding over the keys with a grace that seemed to defy his small, thin frame. There were days when fatigue forced him to stop early, but he never complained, his determination shining through in the way he'd whisper, "I'll play it better tomorrow, Mommy." For Isabella, each note he played was a reminder that they were still moving forward, however slowly. The night of the event, Margaret's restaurant was transformed. Twinkling lights draped across the ceiling, tables set with candles, the smell of garlic and herbs mingling with the hum of conversation. Patrons filled the room, regulars, local families, even a few strangers drawn in by the promise of a good cause. Isabella sat near the stage, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as Ethan climbed onto the bench, his feet barely touching the floor. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, and then the first notes rang out, soft, tentative, then swelling with confidence. He played with a clarity and emotion that silenced even the clinking of cutlery, his music weaving through the air like a thread pulling everyone closer. When the final chord faded, the applause was thunderous, bringing tears to Isabella's eyes. Margaret caught her gaze from across the room and gave a small, triumphant nod. By the end of the night, they had raised enough to cover several months of treatment, but more importantly, Ethan had seen the power of his own gift. As they walked home under the glow of street lamps, Ethan held Isabella's hand and said, "I think Grandma Marina would have liked that." Isabella squeezed his hand, her voice thick as she whispered, "She would have loved it." The weeks following the charity event felt like a slow, gentle thaw after a long winter. Ethan's treatments were consistent now, the financial pressure temporarily eased by the money raised. His color returned little by little, and Isabella began to notice subtle but encouraging changes, the way his appetite improved, how he no longer tired so quickly after walking a few blocks, the brightness returning to his eyes when he talked about music. Each afternoon, he would sit at the piano, his small hands dancing over the keys with more strength than before, his melodies carrying a liveliness that had been missing for months. Isabella would often stand in the doorway, listening, letting the sound fill the cracks in her own spirit. The community seemed to rally around them in quiet ways. The florist downstairs occasionally left bouquets outside their door just because. The bakery where Isabella sometimes worked offered her extra hours without being asked. Even strangers from the charity event sent handwritten cards wishing Ethan well. It was as if the world, which had felt so cold and indifferent, had decided to nudge them forward with small acts of grace. One crisp Saturday morning, there was a knock at the door, and Isabella opened it to find Clara standing there, holding a small basket of fresh bread and fruit. Clara had been visiting more often since the charity event, each time staying longer, her initial reserve softening into something warmer. That day, she stayed for coffee, and their conversation stretched from polite updates to shared laughter over family stories. Eventually, Clara's tone shifted, her gaze lowering as she confessed, "I don't agree with anything Nathan has done. I cut ties with him months ago." Isabella was taken aback. She had assumed Clara kept her visits quiet to avoid conflict with her brother. Clara explained that watching Nathan's treatment of Isabella and Ethan had been the final push she needed to walk away from his toxic influence. "You've shown more strength than anyone I know," she said quietly, "and I want to help however I can." Her words weren't just an offer, they were a bridge, one that connected Isabella to a piece of Nathan's family without the shadow of his presence. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt the possibility of trusting someone from that side again. The afternoon ended with Clara sitting beside Ethan at the piano, letting him teach her a simple melody. They laughed when she missed notes, and he corrected her with the seriousness of a seasoned instructor. Watching them, Isabella felt something she hadn't dared to feel in months: hope. Not just for Ethan's health, but for a future that wasn't defined by loss or struggle. That night, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he asked if Aunt Clara could come by again soon. "She makes the house feel happy," he said with a sleepy smile. Isabella kissed his forehead and promised she would. Lying in bed later, she thought about how far they had come since the night Nathan had walked away. They weren't free of challenges, not by a long shot, but the path ahead didn't feel quite so dark anymore. And in the quiet of her small apartment, with the scent of Clara's bread still lingering in the air, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were on their way to something better. It started with a phone recording, nothing staged, nothing polished, just Ethan at the piano one quiet evening, the golden light from the lamp pooling over his small frame. Isabella had been tidying the living room when she paused to watch him play, his fingers moving with a confidence and elegance that belied his age. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and captured the moment, his face bent in concentration, the soft hum of his voice weaving into the melody. Later, she sent the video to Margaret, who posted it on the restaurant's social media page alongside a caption about the little boy who had played at the charity event. Neither of them expected what happened next. Overnight, the video began to spread, first among the restaurant's followers, then beyond, as strangers shared it with captions like "This boy's music will heal your soul" and "7 years old and already a prodigy." Within a week, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. The comments poured in, offers for music lessons, invitations to play at local events, and even a message from a regional arts foundation wanting to sponsor his training. Isabella read each message in disbelief, the reality sinking in slowly. Ethan's gift was no longer a quiet thing in their small apartment, it was a voice the world had begun to hear. The invitations brought both excitement and hesitation. Ethan's health had improved, but Isabella was wary of pushing him too hard, afraid that too much attention could overwhelm him. She spoke to Daniel, who assured her that as long as his schedule balanced rest with activity, there was no harm in letting him perform. Clara offered to help manage the flood of inquiries, sorting through messages and politely declining those that felt opportunistic. The first event they accepted was a local arts fair, small enough to feel manageable but large enough to give Ethan a taste of performing for an audience beyond their immediate circle. On the day of the fair, Ethan wore a crisp white shirt and navy suspenders, his hair neatly combed but still stubbornly curling at the edges. Isabella sat in the front row, her heart thudding as he began to play. The crowd, a mix of artists, families, and curious onlookers, grew still within moments, drawn into the richness of the sound coming from someone so young. When he finished, the applause was thunderous, and for the first time, Isabella saw him smile, not just shyly, but with the pure, unguarded joy of a child doing exactly what he was meant to do. That night, back in their apartment, Ethan asked her, "Do you think Grandma Marina would be proud of me?" The question caught her off guard, but she smiled, brushing his hair back. "She already is, sweetheart. She always has been." As he drifted to sleep, Isabella sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The last few years had been marked by survival, fighting for each day, each bill, each ounce of strength. But now, there was something else in the air, something that felt like the first breath after a long dive. The comeback wasn't just Ethan's, it was hers too. They were no longer only defined by what they had lost, they were beginning to be shaped by what they were building. And as she listened to the faint hum of Ethan's lullaby from his room, she knew they were stepping into a chapter neither of them could have imagined back when the world had felt so unbearably small. The weeks after the arts fair felt like stepping into a world Isabella had only seen from a distance. Offers began to arrive not just from local venues but from prestigious music schools, cultural festivals, and even a children's television program looking to feature young talents. What astonished her most was the diversity of the opportunities. Some wanted Ethan for classical performances, others for collaborations with contemporary musicians, and a few offered scholarships that could provide him with training she could never afford on her own. Clara, now acting as an informal manager, meticulously filtered through the flood of invitations, rejecting anything that seemed to exploit Ethan's story rather than honor his talent. Margaret, ever the protector, reminded Isabella to guard Ethan's health above all else. "This is his gift, Bella," she said over coffee one morning. "But it's also his childhood. Don't let one steal from the other." Isabella agreed wholeheartedly. She was determined to ensure that Ethan's music was a joy, not a burden. Still, she couldn't deny that these opportunities were opening doors she'd once thought permanently closed. The idea that her son's talent could also provide them with stability was something she had never dared to dream. The first major breakthrough came in the form of an invitation from the Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra, offering Ethan a spot as a featured guest at their annual fundraising gala. The letter was formal and respectful, praising his remarkable musicality and extraordinary promise. Isabella read it twice before showing it to Ethan, whose eyes widened in awe. "That's where the big kids play, right?" he asked, already imagining himself on stage. The weeks leading up to the event were a whirlwind of rehearsals, fittings for a tiny tuxedo, and planning the trip. Daniel adjusted Ethan's treatment schedule so he would be at his strongest, while Clara handled logistics. On the night of the gala, as they stepped into the grand hall, Isabella was struck by the sheer scale of it, the soaring ceilings, the glittering chandeliers, the rows of elegantly dressed patrons. When Ethan walked onto the stage, the room seemed to collectively lean forward. He began to play, and for the next 5 minutes, the world outside those walls ceased to exist. The audience was captivated, and when the final note hung in the air before fading into silence, the applause rose like a wave, crashing over them both. Isabella's chest ached with pride, her eyes blurring as she watched her son bow with the poise of someone far beyond his years. The performance changed everything. Overnight, Ethan's name began appearing in music blogs, local newspapers, and online forums dedicated to young prodigies. A respected talent agent reached out with an offer to represent him, and several recording studios expressed interest in producing an album of his performances. Isabella, cautious but hopeful, began to navigate this new terrain, knowing that with each opportunity came new challenges. She was careful to shield Ethan from the pressure, reminding him that his music should always remain his own. Yet deep down, she couldn't help but feel a cautious optimism. They had walked through years of darkness, through hospital corridors and sleepless nights, through Nathan's cold abandonment and the daily grind of survival. Now, it felt as though the world was finally listening, not to their struggles, but to the beauty they had managed to grow from them. And as she watched Ethan sketch melodies at the kitchen table, humming to himself in the warm glow of their small apartment, Isabella understood that these open doors were not just for him, they were for both of them, leading to a life they had begun to think was beyond their reach. The first sign of Nathan's reappearance came not through a phone call or a knock on the door, but in the form of a glossy magazine cover. Isabella had been waiting in line at the grocery store, half listening to Ethan hum softly beside her, when her eyes landed on the photo, Nathan in a tailored suit, standing beside a glamorous brunette at some corporate charity gala. The headline boasted his remarkable resilience in a changing market, but what caught Isabella's attention was the small blurb in the corner, an upcoming interview on a local news channel. She told herself it was irrelevant, that Nathan's life had no place in theirs anymore. But 2 days later, as she walked home from the florist shop below their apartment, she found him leaning casually against the building's brick wall, hands in his pockets as though he had simply been passing by. "Bella," he greeted, his voice smooth, almost nostalgic. For a heartbeat, she felt the old reflex to respond kindly, but it was quickly overridden by the memory of hospital corridors and legal envelopes. Before she could speak, Ethan's footsteps on the stairs made Nathan's gaze shift, and in that moment she understood why he was here. It wasn't for her. Nathan wasted no time dressing his intentions in pleasantries. "I've been following Ethan's success," he began, his tone carrying the same transactional warmth she remembered from their marriage. "He's become quite the sensation. You must be proud." His eyes gleamed in a way that set her on edge, not the soft pride of a father, but the sharp calculation of a man eyeing an investment. He spoke about opportunities and partnerships, weaving in remarks about how the Carter name could open even more doors for Ethan. Isabella listened in tight-lipped silence until he finally said what she suspected he'd been circling toward all along. With my connections, we could secure serious contracts, and naturally, I'd expect a fair percentage for facilitating them. She almost laughed, the audacity so staggering it bordered on absurd. You walked away, Nathan, she said, her voice low but steady. You don't get to come back when it's convenient and call yourself part of this. His expression hardened, the charm slipping like a mask no longer needed. Think carefully, he warned. I have rights. The words lingered in the cold air like a threat, and Isabella felt the first prickle of dread that this was far from over. That night, she told Clara about the encounter. Her former sister-in-law's reaction was immediate and fierce. He'll use every trick he knows to get what he wants, Clara said, her jaw tight. But you have something now that he can't fake, Ethan's trust, and the truth of everything that happened. Clara offered to connect Isabella with a reputable entertainment lawyer she knew, someone who could help preempt whatever legal games Nathan might try. Margaret, upon hearing the news, was less diplomatic. If he shows his face at the restaurant, I'll personally throw him out, she declared. Even Daniel, who rarely let his emotions show, quietly told Isabella that if Nathan ever tried to interfere with Ethan's medical care or schedule, he'd back her all the way. Surrounded by this small circle of fierce loyalty, Isabella felt steadier, but she couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. Nathan had resources, experience, and a knack for manipulation. She knew him well enough to understand that he wouldn't simply walk away now that he saw value in what he had once discarded. What she didn't yet know was how far he was willing to go, or that their next confrontation would take place not on a street corner, but in a courtroom, under the scrutiny of a judge who would decide once and for all whose side the law was on. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, its thick envelope and embossed law firm logo making Isabella's stomach twist before she even opened it. Inside was a formal summons. Nathan was taking her to court, seeking a percentage of Ethan's earnings under the claim that, as his biological father, he was entitled to a share of any income generated under the Carter name. Reading the legal jargon felt like wading through cold water, each sentence heavier than the last. He framed it as though his absence had been inconsequential, as though his years of abandonment could be erased by a sudden claim of paternal rights. Isabella sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands, while Ethan hummed quietly from the living room, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. She called Clara immediately, her voice tight with a mix of fear and disbelief. Clara's reaction was swift. I told you he'd try this. But we'll fight it. He can't twist the truth in front of people who know the whole story. By evening, she was sitting in an office across from Leah Morrison, a sharp-eyed entertainment lawyer Clara had recommended. Leah listened intently, taking notes as Isabella recounted the years of Nathan's absence, his refusal to pay medical bills, and the circumstances under which he had left. This isn't about what's fair to Ethan, Leah said finally. This is about greed, and greed can be dismantled in court if you have the right evidence. The courthouse on the day of the hearing buzzed with tension. Reporters had caught wind of the case, and though Isabella tried to shield Ethan from the attention, she couldn't stop the curious stares as they walked inside. Nathan was already seated at the petitioner's table, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression calm, almost smug. His attorney, Michael Green, exuded confidence as he shuffled through his papers, clearly relishing the spectacle. Isabella sat beside Leah, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. When proceedings began, Michael's opening argument painted Nathan as a concerned father who had regrettably been separated from his son due to marital breakdown, yet had always harbored the desire to be involved. He claimed Nathan's connections could elevate Ethan's career, and that his client merely sought a fair share of the profits generated from his son's extraordinary talent. It was a performance, carefully worded, emotionally calculated, and for a moment, Isabella feared how persuasive it might sound to someone who didn't know the truth. But when it was Leah's turn, her voice was steady, precise. She laid out a timeline of Nathan's abandonment, backed by medical records, financial statements, and even messages in which he refused to contribute to Ethan's care. The judge, Helen Whitmore, listened intently, occasionally glancing at Nathan with a sharpness that gave Isabella a flicker of hope. The turning point came when Leah called Clara to the stand. Clara spoke calmly but firmly, detailing how Nathan had severed contact not only with Isabella but with his own family, how he had shown no interest in Ethan's well-being until the boy became successful. Margaret testified next, her fiery words cutting through the courtroom's formalities as she described the night she had brought food to Isabella's apartment, the charity event where Ethan had played despite his illness, and Nathan's complete absence through it all. Even Daniel, who had never sought the spotlight, spoke as a medical professional about the extent of Ethan's condition during those years and the sacrifices Isabella had made to keep him alive. By the time Leah delivered her closing argument, the picture was clear. Nathan wasn't a father seeking involvement, he was a man trying to profit from a child he had once discarded. Judge Whitmore's ruling was swift and decisive. Nathan had no claim to Ethan's earnings, now or in the future. The gavel fell, and the sound was like a release of years of tension. Nathan's face tightened, the smugness replaced by something harder, more brittle. Isabella didn't look at him as she left the courtroom, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long while, she knew they had truly won, not just in the eyes of the law, but in reclaiming the life Nathan had tried to take from them. News of Nathan's court defeat spread faster than either of them expected. The local press, already intrigued by the high-profile nature of the case, ran detailed coverage that painted Nathan in an unflattering light. Headlines like "Absent Father Tries to Claim Prodigy's Wealth," fails spectacularly appeared in both print and online outlets. Social media was even less forgiving. Clips of the courtroom testimony circulated, with strangers praising Isabella's strength and condemning Nathan's greed. Corporate partners, wary of negative publicity, began quietly distancing themselves from him. Invitations to networking events dried up, and the polished facade he had cultivated for years began to crack. His business ventures, once propped up by reputation as much as capital, started to crumble. Investors withdrew, leaving him scrambling to cover mounting debts. The glamorous brunette who had been his constant companion vanished from his side within weeks, her social media account scrubbed clean of any mention of him. For the first time in his adult life, Nathan was alone, not surrounded by allies and admirers, but by the echo of his own choices. While Nathan's life unraveled, Isabella and Ethan's world was steadying in a way that felt almost unreal. The absence of legal threats allowed them to breathe freely again. Ethan's music career, guided carefully by Clara and Isabella, continued to flourish. He performed at select events, his reputation growing not because of overexposure, but because each performance was memorable, authentic, and brimming with heart. Offers for international appearances came in, but Isabella chose the ones that allowed Ethan to remain grounded and healthy. Margaret often joked that she had become the unofficial head of Ethan's security detail, fiercely protective whenever anyone with questionable motives approached. Clara remained a quiet but constant force, handling negotiations with a precision that reminded Isabella of the best kind of family, one you could choose. Daniel's medical care ensured Ethan stayed strong, and their little apartment above the florist shop remained their safe haven, filled with music, laughter, and the scent of fresh flowers drifting up from below. Nathan's attempts to contact them dwindled over time. The occasional email, thinly veiled pleas disguised as business opportunities, went unanswered. He was last spotted by Clara in a dimly lit bar near the financial district, nursing a drink and looking like a shadow of the man he used to be. Word eventually reached Isabella that he had sold his penthouse and most of his assets to cover debts, moving into a modest rental far from the city's elite circles he once dominated. There was no triumph in knowing this, only a quiet sense of closure. Nathan's downfall wasn't about revenge, it was the inevitable result of a life built on selfishness and exploitation. Isabella didn't dwell on it. Instead, she focused on the life she and Ethan had carved out of hardship, a life where love and loyalty mattered more than profit or status. As winter began to give way to spring, she could feel the next chapter of their story unfolding, not with the desperation of survival, but with the steady confidence of new beginnings waiting just ahead. Spring arrived in the city with a gentleness Isabella hadn't felt in years. The air was warmer, the days longer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her mornings began without the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. She and Ethan had moved into a slightly larger home on the edge of town, a modest but beautiful house with wide windows that caught the morning sun and a small garden where tulips and lavender now swayed in the breeze. The piano sat in the center of their living room, polished to a soft gleam, its presence no longer a symbol of struggle but of triumph. Ethan's schedule was still carefully balanced between school, music practice, and rest, but there was a lightness to him now, a vibrancy that came from knowing he was free to dream without the shadow of someone else's greed. Isabella resumed painting regularly, her easel positioned near a window overlooking the garden. The colors she chose were brighter than before, her brushstrokes bolder, as though the canvas itself could feel the change in her spirit. Each day began with the aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchen and the sound of Ethan experimenting on the keys, sometimes classical, sometimes playful improvisations that made her laugh. Their community, too, had become an unshakable pillar. Margaret continued to be a near-daily presence, her quick wit and generous spirit filling their home with warmth. Clara, now firmly a part of their chosen family, accompanied them to Ethan's concerts and often stayed late afterward, talking with Isabella over tea about everything from travel dreams to art exhibitions. Daniel remained in their lives as both doctor and friend, a quiet, dependable presence who always seemed to know when to check in. Even the florist downstairs had become part of the family rhythm, leaving fresh blooms outside their door every week, a tradition that began unasked and had simply continued. When Ethan was invited to perform at an international youth music festival in Vienna, Isabella hesitated only long enough to ensure his health could keep pace with the demands. They accepted, and the news was met with celebration from every corner of their circle. It wasn't just an achievement for Ethan, it was a victory for all of them, a testament to resilience, love, and the quiet power of refusing to give up. On the evening before they were due to fly out for the festival, Isabella and Ethan stood in the garden, watching the last light of day slip beyond the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lavender, and a soft breeze ruffled Ethan's hair. "We've come a long way, haven't we, Mommy?" he said, his voice tinged with both awe and certainty. Isabella knelt so they were eye to eye, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied softly. "And we're just getting started." She knew life would still hold its challenges, no path was without them, but she also knew they had built something unshakable, a foundation no one could take away. Nathan was nothing more than a closed chapter, a name she no longer spoke, while the future stretched out before them like an open canvas, ready for color. As they went inside, the piano waited in the living room, and Ethan sat down to play. The notes floated out into the night, carried on the spring air, a melody not of survival but of hope. It was the sound of new beginnings, and for the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to believe that the best parts of their story were still yet to come. The end.